It was the 4th of October, a Tuesday, and the frost had come down hard enough that morning to silver the fence wire, which is how I knew the ground under my boots would be stiff by 10 and soft again by noon. I remember it exactly because I signed the papers on that farm with a cold pen in a cold room, and the ink went down thin and gray the way ink does when the barrel's chilled through. That was the whole price of the place. 160 acres and a caved barn and a house with a sway-back roof, and the man behind the desk at the county recorder's office said it twice 400. Like maybe I hadn't heard him the first time and would come to my senses. I heard him fine. I was 61 years old, and I had heard a great many people tell me things twice that year. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The frost, the cold pen, the $400, and the man who thought I was a fool. I won't pretend he was the only one. My neighbor to the east, a fellow named Harlan Pruitt, who ran 1,000 acres of corn on ground so flat and rich it practically farmed itself, drove his truck up my new lane the following Saturday just to lean out the window. He said, "Ada, you know why that place went for $400, don't you?" I said I supposed I did. He said the last 3 families that tried to live off it went broke doing it, and the water's bad and the ground's sour, and there's not a bank in this county would loan a dime against it. Then he tipped his cap in that way a man does, when he's being kind and cruel in the same motion, and he drove back down the lane, and I stood there a while and let the cold come up through my boots. It wasn't the grinning that stayed with me. It was that he was mostly right, and I knew it. And I'd bought the place anyway. The trouble with that 160 acres was as old as the county. My great-aunt Cordelia had owned it once, back before I was born, and she'd worked it 40 years and left it, and my father had spoken of it, the way you speak of a relation who drinks with love and a lowered voice. Nothing grew right on the low 40. The wheat came up yellow and thin. The corn tasseled early and gave up. Cattle you turned out on the west pasture would drink from the creek and stand there looking wronged. Everybody who'd ever tried had blamed the water, and everybody who blamed the water had eventually walked away from it, and the price had fallen with each family until it hit the floor at $400, which is what a thing costs when nobody living believes in it anymore. Now, I want to tell you why I bought it, because it wasn't sentiment, though. There was some of that. It was a book. When my father passed the spring before, I'd cleaned out the little house he'd kept his whole life, and in a trunk under the eave I found a bundle of ledgers and daybooks that had belonged to Cordelia herself. She'd been a great one for writing things down: weather, prices, what the hens laid, what the sky did. And in the last of those daybooks, the one she kept the year before she quit the farm, there was a line I read standing up in that dusty attic, and then sat down on the floor to read again. She'd written in a hand gone shaky with age, "Water don't spoil ground. It's the ground telling you what water it wants. Learn to read the well before you curse it." I read that a 3rd time. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew Cordelia had farmed that place longer than anyone before or since, and that she hadn't gone broke on it, she'd only gone old, and that when a woman who succeeded where everyone else failed leaves you a sentence like that, you fold it up and you carry it around for a couple of years, which is exactly what I did. I carried it 2 years before. I ever did a thing about it because I was afraid of looking as foolish as everyone already expected me to look. The one person I told before I told anybody was my brother-in-law Walt, who'd been a well driller for 30 years before his knees quit him. He came to supper one night that second winter, and I laid the daybook open on the table, between the bread and the butter, and I read him the line. Walt didn't laugh. That's the thing about Walt. He set down his fork and he read it himself, moving his lips a little. And then he asked me 3 questions. He asked how deep the old well was. He asked whether the creek ran higher or lower than the well in a wet year. And he asked whether anybody had ever tested the water, or whether they'd just tasted it, made a face, and quit. I didn't have an answer to any of the 3. And Walt said, "Well, there's your problem, Ada." They just cursed it. And I felt the hair go up on my arms because that was Cordelia's word, exactly out of a man who'd never seen her book. So that spring, the spring I turned 63, I started reading The Well. The old well sat 40 yards off the back corner of the house, a stone-colored thing near 6 feet across at the mouth, capped over the years with a rotting board and a millstone somebody had rolled onto it a generation back so a child wouldn't fall in. It took Walt and me the better part of a Saturday to lever that millstone off, and when we did, the smell came up. Not foul, exactly, but mineral iron and something else underneath it, a smell like a handful of pennies and wet slate. Walt smelled it and went quiet. I lowered a weighted line and measured the water at 19 feet down and the bottom at 41, which meant 22 feet of standing water in a hand-dug well. And Walt said that was a great deal of water for a farm everybody swore had a water problem. That was the first thing that didn't add up, and I wrote it in my own daybook the way Cordelia would have. 19 feet to water, 41 to bottom, smell of iron and slate. I want to be honest with you about the pace of this because it did not happen fast, and I won't pretend it did. It was slow, the way real things are slow. I sent a jar of that well water off to the state lab in April, and it cost me $11 and took 5 weeks to come back. And when it came back, it was a single sheet of paper with a column of numbers on it that I could not read any better than I could read Chinese. So I drove the 40 miles to the county extension office to have somebody explain it to me. And that is where I met the institutional doubt I'd been warned about, only it wore a friendly face. The extension agent was a decent enough man named Dale who'd been to college and had a diploma on the wall and a way of talking down to you so gently you almost thanked him for it. He looked at my sheet and he said, "Well, Ada, this water's got iron in it, and it's got a high mineral load. And honestly, this confirms what folks have known about that quarter section for 50 years. It's just not good ground." He said the kindest thing I could do was run a few cows on it, take the small loss and enjoy the quiet. Then he said, and I remember this because it stung, he said, and he quoted me a price to have a modern, deep, well-drilled and a filtration system put in, $11,000, and he said it in the tone of a man who knows he's naming a number to end a conversation. I drove home the 40 miles with the radio off. That was the low point, if you want to call it that. And it came right about the middle of everything. I sat at my own table that night with Cordelia's daybook and the lab sheets side by side, and I felt every one of my 63 years, and I thought about Harlan Pruitt grinning out his truck window. And I thought maybe they were all right, and I was a foolish old woman who'd bought a swayback house and a bad well for $400 because she couldn't let go of a dead aunt's handwriting. I read the line again. Water don't spoil ground. It's the ground telling you what water it wants. Learn to read the well before you curse it. And I read it again out loud, that time, in the empty kitchen. And something in it turned over for me, sitting there, that hadn't turned over before. Everyone, including Dale with his diploma, had read that lab sheet as a list of what was wrong with the water. But Cordelia hadn't written that the water was wrong. She'd written that the ground was asking for something. What if the iron and the minerals and that penny and slate smell weren't the problem at all? What if they were the answer, and every family for 50 years had been throwing the answer down the drain? I called Walt in the morning. Here is what Walt and I worked out over the next many weeks, and I'll tell it plain, because it took us a long time and a lot of walking to see it. We took the elevation of the well and the elevation of the low 40 where nothing grew, and the elevation of the creek using a builder's level Walt had, and a lot of patience, and we found that the low 40 sat in a shallow bowl, 4 feet lower than the ground around it, and that the well and the creek and that bowl were all tied together underground through a seam of gravel you could see in the creek cut if you knew to look. And the thing everybody had called bad water, that iron-heavy, mineral-heavy well water, was the very same water that seeped up into the low 40 from below in a wet year and stood there and soured everything. The families before me had all done the same thing. They'd looked at a field that wouldn't grow and dug it, drained it, tiled it, and cursed it, and they'd looked at a well that smelled like pennies and capped it and hauled their drinking water from town. They'd treated the well and the field as 2 separate troubles, but Cordelia had known they were one thing, one seam, one water, and the mistake wasn't the water. That water wanted to move, and for 50 years everybody had been fighting to make it stand still. Now, the reading of it was one thing. The doing of it was another. And this is where I want to be careful, because the temptation in a story like this is to make it sound like a trick. It wasn't a trick. It was a system, and a slow one. What Cordelia had done, and what her own daybooks laid out once I knew to look for the pattern in her weekly entries. She wrote things like opened the low gate, closed the high gate 3 days, which had meant nothing to me before. What she had done was manage that water instead of fighting it. She had cut shallow channels no deeper than a spade's depth that let the mineral water off the well side flow slowly across the low 40 in the dry months, when the ground was thirsty and the minerals fed it, and she'd blocked those same channels in the wet months so the water. Iron in standing water rots roots. Iron in moving water spread thin over dry ground in July as food. The whole difference between poison and fertilizer on that farm. Managing, not conquering. That was the hard part, and the hard part was timing, because you had to open the low gate at the right week and close the high gate at the right week, and if you got it wrong by 10 days, you'd flood the very field you were trying to feed. We built it out of almost nothing. Walt had an old Transit and a spade, and I had 2 years of savings I'd meant for a roof. And between us that summer and fall, we dug about 1,100 feet of shallow channel by hand, following the contour lines Cordelia had marked in her book by the old fence posts, some of which were still standing. We set 3 simple wooden gates, boards in a slotted frame, one at the well outlet, one at the head of the low 40, one at the creek side. Nothing that a man in 1890 couldn't have built, because a woman in 1890 essentially had. The whole works, gates and lumber, and the pump we rigged to lift the well water the 4 feet it needed, came to $840. I want you to sit with that number against Dale's number. $840 against $11,000. And Cordelia's system didn't filter the iron out. It put the iron where it belonged. Dale came out again in the middle of it. That's the part I haven't told you. Somebody at the courthouse had mentioned to somebody that the old Bly woman was digging trenches all over the poor 40, and Dale drove out to see whether I'd need a permit for what he assumed was some kind of drainage scheme. And he stood at the edge of my field in his clean boots and looked at 1,100 feet of hand-dug channel and 3 board gates, and me, 63 years old, with a spade. And I watched him decide, very kindly, that I had lost my mind. He didn't say it. He asked whether I'd considered the liability of standing water and mosquitoes, and he said he'd have to note the project, and he told me a channel that's shallow would silt in and stop working inside a year. Then he wished me luck in the voice you use on a person you don't expect to see much longer. And he left, and I leaned on the spade a long while and let the doubt come up through my boots, the way the cold had 2 years before. He was educated. He had the diploma. And I had a dead woman's daybook and a smell like pennies and a sentence about reading the well. There were nights that fall I lay awake, certain I'd dug my savings into the ground. But I'd decided to trust the slow of it. So I ran the system the way Cordelia's book said, and I wrote everything down the way she had. Opened the low gate the 9th of June. And the low 40, the poor 40 the ground 3 families had gone broke on, came up that next summer in a green I had never seen on that farm. Not all at once. That's the thing nobody tells you about slow work. It doesn't announce itself. It just is a little better each time you look, until one August evening the light went orange and flat across the field, and I stood at the high gate and saw that the corn in the low bowl stood a full hand, taller than the corn on the good ground around it, and I had to sit down on the gate frame because my legs had gone strange under me. Iron in moving water, spread thin over thirsty ground. Food, not poison. Cordelia had known it 100 years before I was born. The measuring is what turned the neighbors. In the end, not the green. Anybody can argue with a green field. Nobody can argue with a scale. That first full year I ran the system, the low 40 made 11 more bushels an acre than Harlan Pruitt's best flat corn, on ground he'd have paid you to take off his hands. 11 bushels. And the second year, when the channels had settled and I'd learned the timing to within a couple of days, it made 19 more. That was when the young woman from the university came. Her name was Petra, and she couldn't have been 30, and she came out with a truck full of instruments, probes she pushed down into the soil that read moisture and mineral content on a little screen, and jars, and that hunger to understand a thing that doesn't make sense yet. Somebody at the extension office had finally gotten curious enough about the numbers coming off the poor 40 to send somebody to check them. She spent 3 days on that farm. She pushed her probes into the low bowl and into the high ground and into the channels, and she tested the well water and the creek water, and the water standing thin across the field in the dry weeks. And on the 3rd evening she sat at my kitchen table with her screen and her clipboard, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I can't fully explain the iron behavior with what I've got here." She said, "By every model I know, this water should be degrading this soil, and instead, the soil chemistry in your low field is better than anything in the county. She said the minerals were binding in a way she'd have to take back to the university to understand, that the slow movement and the dry season timing were doing something to the ground that no filtration system and no fertilizer program she'd ever seen. Then she set down her pen, and she said, "The thing I'll carry the rest of my life." She said, "Whoever designed this system understood this ground better than I do." I told her a woman named Cordelia had designed it, and that she'd been dead 40 years and that she'd written it down in a book. Petra asked, very carefully, whether she might photograph the book. I said she could read it. Harlan Pruitt came up my lane one more time, the fall after Petra's visit, and it was the 4th of October again, near enough, with the frost silvering the fence wire the same as the day I'd signed the papers. He didn't lean out the window and grin. He got out of the truck, which for Harlan was a whole speech in itself, and he stood at the edge of the low 40 with his cap in his hand, and he looked at it a long time. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, Ada. Just that. I owe you an apology." And I didn't say anything back, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and because a thing like that ought to be allowed to just sit in the cold air between two old people who've known each other. He put his cap back on, and he asked, quiet, whether I'd show him sometime how the gates worked. I said I would. That was the end of the grinning, and I never once said, "I told you so," because Cordelia's book had told him, not me. She wasn't there to say it. I'll give you the numbers plain, because I promised myself I'd never dress this up. That farm I bought for $400 now makes a living. Not a fortune. A living. The low 40, the poor 40, is the best ground I have, and I have never drilled a deep well or bought a bag of filter media, and the whole system that did it cost $840 and a great deal of walking and 2 years of being afraid to start. The university made a study of it. Petra put my name and Cordelia's name both on it, and there is a copy of Cordelia's daybook now, the real pages, kept in the county historical collection under glass, opened to the lines so that it can't get thrown out with the mouse droppings the next time somebody dies and somebody else cleans out a trunk. Water don't spoil ground. It's the ground telling you what water it wants. Learn to read the well before you curse it. That's the line. That's the whole of it. I'm an old woman now, older than Cordelia was when she quit the place. And I stand at the high gate most evenings when the light goes orange and flat, and I think about how much certainty gets buried under a millstone by people in a hurry. The families before me weren't stupid. Dale wasn't stupid. They were fast. And fast is a kind of blindness. They looked at a well that smelled like pennies, and they knew right away what it was. Trouble, and being sure that fast, they never bent down and read it. Cordelia was slow, and slow let her see that the trouble and the answer were the same water, only pointed the wrong way. The difference between a problem and a resource, I've come to think, is just whether you've learned to read the ground. That's all it ever was. Paying attention is the whole of the craft. There isn't a second secret hiding behind it. So I'll leave you with this, wherever you are. Most everybody has a piece of ground somewhere in their life that the people around them have already agreed is no good. A job, a house, an old idea, a stretch of family that everybody's given up on. And most everybody's been told to cap it over and haul their water from somewhere else. I'd only ask you to bend down first and smell the pennies and ask whether The thing you were told was poison might just be food that's pointed the wrong way. Then I'd like you to tell me about it. Whatever your poor 40 is, whatever ground in your life the others have laughed at and priced at $400, leave it in the comments. And let me know if you ever learned to read your own. Well, I'd like to hear. I really would.